Widowed mafia boss's twin daughters couldn't sleep. Until a poor maid changed everything. Why couldn't the twin daughters sleep? And how could a poor maid possibly change everything? Welcome to the channel. We're so glad you're here for another heartfelt story filled with emotion, hope, and unforgettable moments. If you enjoy inspiring stories like this one, please subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss a new upload. Thank you for your continued support. It truly means the world to us and helps this community grow. Before we begin, tell us in the comments, what do you think can make the biggest difference in a child's life during a difficult time? Now, settle in, take a comfortable seat, and let's step into a story where quiet compassion may hold more power than anyone could ever imagine. Some houses become quiet after tragedy. Others become so silent that even sleep is afraid to enter. For 47 consecutive nights, the DeLuca mansion stood beneath the pale glow of the Long Island moon like a fortress holding its breath. Every hallway remained polished to perfection. Every chandelier reflected warm golden light across imported marble floors, and every priceless painting watched over rooms where no laughter had survived for months. Yet as midnight crept past the grandfather clock in the entrance hall, the silence shattered once again. Two small voices echoed from the third floor, trembling with fear too deep for children their age to understand. 6-year-old twins Emma and Isabella DeLuca had not slept through a single night since losing their mother. The finest pediatric specialists had come and gone. Child psychologists filled notebooks with observations. Professional nannies arrived carrying glowing recommendations and left only days later with exhausted eyes and resignation letters. Soft music, bedtime stories, calming lights, expensive toys, weighted blankets, and every gentle remedy money could buy had failed. Each sunset seemed to awaken an invisible storm inside the girls that no one could explain. Downstairs, the staff moved with practiced silence, speaking in whispers as though louder voices might awaken old memories hidden within the mansion's walls. Everyone understood one unspoken rule. Never go to the third floor after dark unless Mr. Lorenzo DeLuca personally called for you. The widowed mafia boss had become a man wrapped in discipline, routine, and grief. He rarely raised his voice. He rarely smiled. Most nights he remained seated alone outside his daughter's bedroom, staring at the closed door until dawn painted the windows gray. He blamed himself for every tear they cried, even if he never admitted it aloud. The mansion had become less of a home and more of a monument to everything he had lost. Earlier that same afternoon, a new housemaid quietly stepped through the servants' entrance carrying a single worn canvas bag that held nearly everything she owned. Her name was Amara Johnson. At 34, she had learned that kindness often spoke louder than confidence, so she introduced herself with a gentle smile instead of grand promises. Most of the household barely noticed her arrival. New employees rarely lasted long enough for names to matter. The head housekeeper handed her a neatly folded uniform and offered only one piece of advice before walking away. Keep your head down, do your work, and never climb the staircase to the third floor after sunset. Amara nodded politely, but something in the older woman's eyes suggested the warning carried more sadness than fear. As evening settled over the estate and the last rays of sunlight disappeared behind towering oak trees, Amara quietly finished polishing a long hallway when she froze. Through layers of polished wood, thick walls, and endless silence came a sound unlike ordinary crying. It was softer, more fragile, almost as if two tiny hearts were searching through the darkness for someone who would never answer again. Every person in the mansion had learned to ignore those sounds. Amara couldn't. Amara stood perfectly still, her hand resting against the polished walnut wall as the quiet sobs drifted through the mansion once more. They were not loud enough to wake the household, yet they carried a weight that settled deep inside her chest. She had heard children cry before. She had heard frightened children, lonely children, and children who simply wanted another glass of water before bedtime. This was different. These cries sounded as though they had stopped expecting anyone to come. She glanced toward the grand staircase. Every instinct told her to respect the rules she had been given only hours earlier. A first-day employee who ignored instructions rarely earned a second chance. Still, as another trembling voice whispered through the silence, her feet refused to walk away. She climbed one step at a time, careful enough that even the old wooden railings remained quiet beneath her fingertips. The third floor welcomed her with an almost sacred stillness. Family portraits lined the hallway, each one capturing happier years when smiles had filled the mansion naturally. One photograph caught her attention. A beautiful woman with warm eyes knelt between two little girls whose matching curls framed identical bright smiles, while Lorenzo De Luca stood proudly behind them, with one protective hand resting on each tiny shoulder. Dust had not gathered on the frame. Someone cleaned it every day. Yet the joy inside that picture felt impossibly distant from the sorrow filling the hallway now. The bedroom door remained slightly open. Warm amber light spilled softly across the floor. Amara did not rush inside. Instead, she gently lowered herself onto the hallway floor beside the doorway, making certain her presence could not startle anyone. She waited. The crying continued, broken by uneven breathing and frightened whispers that she could not quite understand. Closing her eyes for a brief moment, she remembered the old lullaby her grandmother had sung during summer storms in Savannah when thunder rattled every window in their tiny house. It was never a performance. It was simply a melody that reminded frightened hearts they were not alone. Barely above a whisper, Amara began humming the familiar tune. The notes floated slowly through the hallway, gentle enough to blend with the quiet night rather than interrupt it. For several moments, nothing changed. Then one small voice stopped crying. Another followed. The room became still enough that she could hear the soft ticking of a bedside clock. She did not move closer. She did not peek inside. She simply continued humming, allowing the melody to fill the empty spaces grief had carved into the mansion. A tiny voice finally drifted toward the doorway. "Is Mommy singing?" Another answered with innocent uncertainty. "It sounds warm." Tears gathered in Amara's eyes, but she blinked them away before they could fall. No child deserved to mistake kindness for a memory they feared losing forever. She remained seated outside the room, offering nothing except patience and a quiet song. Somewhere farther down the hallway, hidden beyond the shadows, another pair of eyes had been watching every moment in complete silence. Lorenzo De Luca had spent months believing he understood every sound that echoed through his home. He could recognize the quiet footsteps of the night security team, the distant hum of the climate control system, and even the soft creak of the library doors settling after midnight. Yet tonight, there was something unfamiliar drifting through the third floor. It was not the sound itself that caught his attention. It was what had disappeared. The crying had stopped. Standing motionless at the end of the hallway, Lorenzo remained hidden in the shadows, his broad shoulders framed by the dim wall sconces that cast warm pools of light across the polished floor. He had walked this hallway every night since his wife's passing, always expecting another sleepless battle that neither love nor money had been able to solve. Instead, he found a new housemaid sitting quietly outside his daughter's bedroom with her hands folded gently in her lap, humming a melody so softly that it barely disturbed the silence surrounding them. She was not trying to impress anyone. She did not know she was being watched. She asked for nothing. She simply stayed. Lorenzo studied her carefully. Every employee who entered his home eventually revealed an agenda. Some wanted higher wages. Others sought influence, security, or favor. Experience had taught him that trust should never be given quickly. Yet there was something impossible to explain about the woman sitting outside that door. She never attempted to enter the room. She never reached for attention. She allowed his daughters to choose peace instead of forcing comfort upon them. It was patience in its purest form. Inside the bedroom, Emma whispered sleepily, "She is still here." Isabella answered with a small yawn. "Do not let her leave." Lorenzo closed his eyes for a brief second as emotion pressed against the carefully built walls around his heart. Those simple words carried more hope than he had heard from his daughters in weeks. He finally stepped forward, his polished dress shoes making the faintest sound against the hardwood floor. Amara immediately stopped humming and stood respectfully, lowering her eyes. She already knew who he was without needing an introduction. His tailored black suit, calm expression, and commanding presence made that obvious. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The mansion itself seemed to wait. Lorenzo glanced toward the bedroom before returning his attention to Amara. His voice, when it finally broke the silence, remained calm but carried quiet authority. "You were instructed not to come upstairs after sunset." Amara nodded without attempting to defend herself. "Yes, sir." Then why are you here? She took a careful breath before answering. Because sometimes children stop asking for help out loud, but they are still hoping someone hears them. Lorenzo expected excuses. He expected apologies. Instead, he received honesty delivered without fear or pride. He searched her face for signs of manipulation and found only quiet concern. Before he could respond, a tiny voice drifted from inside the bedroom. "Daddy," Emma called softly. "Can the singing lady stay a little longer?" Lorenzo looked through the partially open door. Both girls were lying peacefully beneath their blankets, their eyes already growing heavy. It was the closest they had come to sleep in longer than he cared to remember. The hallway fell silent once more. For the first time since grief had entered his home, Lorenzo found himself questioning whether healing had arrived wearing the simple uniform of a housemaid rather than the expensive suit of another specialist. The request lingered in the hallway long after Emma's sleepy voice faded into the quiet. Lorenzo remained standing beside the bedroom door, his gaze moving from his daughters to Amara and back again, as though he feared the moment might disappear if he looked away for too long. The girls had not asked to keep anyone close since their mother's passing. Every nanny who had tried to comfort them had been pushed away within days. Every specialist had offered careful explanations, promising progress that never came. Yet tonight, after only a few gentle notes carried through the hallway, his daughters had spoken with something he had nearly forgotten existed. Hope. Lorenzo lowered his voice even further. 5 more minutes. Amara gave a respectful nod. "Thank you, sir." She did not rush into the room after receiving permission. Instead, she quietly returned to the same place on the floor outside the doorway, keeping enough distance to allow the twins to feel safe without feeling watched. Lorenzo noticed the choice immediately. She understood boundaries without being told. That alone separated her from every professional who had entered this house, believing expensive credentials automatically earned trust. Amara resumed the familiar melody, softer than before, almost blending into the gentle rhythm of the old clock ticking across the hallway. Inside the bedroom, Emma slowly reached for her sister's hand beneath the blankets. Isabella's breathing became slower, steadier, matching the quiet cadence of the song drifting through the open doorway. Lorenzo remained where he was, uncertain whether to leave or continue watching. For months he had measured every night by tears, pacing, and exhaustion. Tonight he found himself counting peaceful breaths instead. Several minutes passed before the room became completely still. The twins had finally fallen asleep, their faces relaxed beneath the warm glow of the bedside lamp. Lorenzo stepped carefully into the bedroom, adjusting each blanket with the practiced tenderness of a father who had performed the same ritual every night despite rarely seeing it end this peacefully. He lingered beside a framed photograph resting on the nightstand. It showed his late wife kneeling between the girls in a sunny garden, all four smiling at something beyond the camera. His fingers lightly touched the edge of the frame before he quietly turned off the brighter lamp, leaving only the small nightlight glowing beside the window. When he stepped back into the hallway, Amara had already risen to leave. She did not expect praise. She did not ask whether she would still have a job tomorrow. She simply gathered herself to return downstairs as though nothing extraordinary had happened. "Miss Johnson," Lorenzo said calmly. She stopped immediately. "Yes, sir." He studied her with the same careful expression he used before making important decisions. "Who taught you that song?" A gentle smile appeared across her face, touched by memories rather than pride. "My grandmother, sir. She believed children do not always need answers before they can rest. Sometimes they only need to know someone is willing to stay." Lorenzo absorbed those words without responding. They sounded painfully simple, yet no one in months had offered anything that honest. Every expert had arrived carrying charts, schedules, and complicated plans. This woman had arrived carrying nothing except patience. As Amara disappeared down the staircase, Lorenzo remained alone outside the bedroom, listening not for crying, but for silence. For the first time in many months, the silence no longer felt empty. It felt alive, fragile, and worth protecting. Morning arrived with a quiet that felt almost unfamiliar inside the DeLuca mansion. Sunlight streamed through towering windows, painting long ribbons of gold across the marble floors, while the scent of freshly brewed coffee drifted from the kitchen. The staff moved carefully through their routines, but today their whispered conversations carried curiosity instead of worry. For the first time in 47 mornings, no one had been awakened by exhausted cries echoing from the third floor before sunrise. Mrs. Bennet, the longtime head housekeeper, paused outside the dining room and looked toward the grand staircase with disbelief. She had served the DeLuca family for nearly 20 years and had watched joy slowly disappear from these halls after tragedy struck. She understood how precious one peaceful night could be. Upstairs, Lorenzo stood quietly outside his daughter's bedroom before gently opening the door. Warm morning light rested across two small beds where Emma and Isabella still slept peacefully, their breathing slow and even. He glanced at the bedside clock twice, almost convinced it had stopped working. It was nearly 8 o'clock. His daughters had not slept this late in months. He stepped closer, brushing a loose curl away from Emma's forehead before adjusting Isabella's blanket. The simple act filled him with emotions he had forgotten how to name. Relief, gratitude, hope. Moments later, two sleepy blue eyes slowly opened. Emma smiled faintly before stretching beneath her blanket. "Good morning, Daddy." Her voice sounded rested instead of exhausted. Isabella rubbed her eyes and looked around the room before asking the first question that came to her mind. "Is the singing lady still here?" Lorenzo felt his heart tighten. Neither child asked for breakfast first. Neither mentioned nightmares. They were looking for the woman whose kindness had quietly reached them where every expensive solution had failed. He offered a small smile. "She is downstairs working." Both girls exchanged relieved glances that seemed far older than 6 years should allow. "Can she come back tonight?" Isabella whispered. Lorenzo did not answer immediately. Instead, he watched them climb out of bed without tears, without panic, and without clinging to fear. It was such an ordinary morning that it felt extraordinary. Downstairs, Amara was arranging fresh flowers in crystal vases along the breakfast room windows, completely unaware that she had become the center of the household's quiet conversations. She worked with the same calm attention she had shown the night before, never expecting recognition. When Lorenzo entered the room, several staff members instinctively stepped aside. The atmosphere shifted as naturally as it always did when he appeared, yet his expression remained thoughtful rather than distant. Amara looked up and greeted him respectfully. "Good morning, sir." Lorenzo studied her for a long moment before speaking. "My daughter slept through the night." Amara smiled softly, not with surprise, but with quiet happiness. "I am very glad to hear that." There was no pride in her voice, only genuine relief for two little girls she barely knew. Lorenzo noticed that as well. "I would like you to adjust your duties," he said calmly. "Beginning today, your primary responsibility will include spending time with Emma and Isabella each evening." Amara blinked with surprise, clearly not expecting the request. "If you believe that is best for them, sir, I would be honored." Lorenzo gave a single nod before turning toward the windows, where sunlight filled the room with warmth that had been missing for far too long. He had hired countless professionals to care for his daughters. Somehow, the person who reached them first was the one who never claimed she could. The days that followed settled into a rhythm no one inside the mansion dared to celebrate too quickly. Hope, everyone had learned, could feel fragile after months of disappointment. Every evening, shortly before sunset painted the sky with soft shades of amber and lavender, Amara quietly climbed the staircase carrying nothing except a small storybook she had borrowed from the mansion library and the same gentle presence that had first reached the twins through a simple melody. She never forced conversation. Some nights Emma wanted to ask endless questions about birds, stars, and why the moon seemed to follow cars home. Other evenings Isabella preferred silence, sitting beside the window while tracing tiny circles across the fogged glass with her fingertip. Amara accepted both without judgment. She understood that healing did not move at the same pace for every heart. Lorenzo watched these moments from a distance more often than anyone realized. Sometimes he stood in the library with its door left slightly open. Other nights he remained halfway down the hallway, pretending to review business documents while quietly listening to laughter that had become almost unfamiliar inside his own home. The sound always stopped him. It was never loud. It was the kind of laughter children made when they finally forgot they had been trying to be brave. One rainy evening, as gentle drops tapped against the tall windows overlooking the gardens, Emma carefully tugged on Amara's sleeve before bedtime. "Will you tell us another story about your grandmother?" she asked. Amara smiled and settled into the rocking chair beside the fireplace. She used to tell me that every storm eventually runs out of rain because even clouds become tired of carrying sadness forever. Isabella looked toward the rain sliding down the glass. Did you believe her? Amara thought for a moment before answering honestly. Not at first. But then one morning the sun always came back, and little by little I started believing again. Neither girl spoke for several seconds. Then Emma quietly whispered, "Maybe our house is waiting for its sunshine too." Unaware that Lorenzo had paused outside the partially open door, the room became still except for the soft crackle of the fire. Those innocent words settled deep inside him. He realized his daughters were no longer asking when their mother would return. Instead, they were beginning to imagine tomorrow. That subtle change meant more than any medical report he had ever received. Later that night, after both girls had fallen asleep peacefully once again, Lorenzo remained standing in the hallway as Amara gently closed the bedroom door behind her. "Miss Johnson," he said. She turned respectfully. "Yes, sir. Walk with me." Together, they moved through the quiet mansion until they reached the glass conservatory overlooking the gardens, where raindrops shimmered beneath elegant lanterns lining the stone paths. Neither spoke immediately. Lorenzo rested one hand against the window before asking the question that had quietly followed him for days. "You understand children far better than your employment records suggest." "What?" Amara lowered her eyes, her reflection blending with the rain beyond the glass. "Life gave me wonderful teachers, sir." Lorenzo waited patiently, sensing there was more behind those carefully chosen words. She finally continued in a calm voice. "Some lessons are learned in classrooms. Others are learned by loving people who need you every single day." Lorenzo studied her expression, realizing that whatever shaped her kindness had not come from textbooks or expensive training programs. It had come from experience carried with quiet dignity. And for the first time in many years, he found himself wanting to understand the story of someone who had entered his house with nothing except compassion and somehow made it feel like a home again. The following afternoon, while Emma and Isabella laughed together over a simple puzzle in the sunroom, Lorenzo sat alone in his private study, surrounded by floor-to-ceiling shelves filled with leather-bound books that had gone untouched for months. A thin folder rested on the polished mahogany desk before him. It contained the background report he had quietly requested after deciding to place his daughters in Amara's care each evening. He had expected to find certificates from childcare programs or years spent working in prestigious homes. Instead, the pages revealed a remarkably ordinary life. Amara Johnson had grown up in Savannah, Georgia, worked part-time through community college, and later spent several years caring for her widowed mother after an early diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease slowly stole familiar memories away. After her mother's passing, she volunteered every weekend at a neighborhood family resource center, reading stories to children whose parents worked multiple jobs or faced difficult circumstances. There were no awards, no headlines, no remarkable achievements recognized by the world. Only years of quiet service that never asked for applause. Lorenzo slowly closed the folder, realizing something unexpected. Every lesson she carried into his home had been earned through love rather than ambition. Later that evening, he found Mrs. Bennett arranging fresh linens in the upstairs hallway. "How long have you known?" he asked. She looked at him with gentle confusion. "Known what, sir?" That Miss Johnson was different. The older woman smiled knowingly. The first morning she arrived, one of the gardeners dropped an entire crate of flower pots near the greenhouse. Before anyone asked, she spent nearly an hour helping him gather every broken piece, because she said no one should clean up disappointment alone. She thought no one noticed. Lorenzo glanced toward the staircase leading to the children's rooms. "I did not." Mrs. Bennett folded another towel before speaking again. "People like Miss Johnson rarely announce who they are, sir. They simply leave every place a little gentler than they found it." Those words lingered in Lorenzo's thoughts long after their conversation ended. That night, while the twins settled beneath their blankets, Amara noticed Emma staring quietly at the framed photograph beside the bed. "Do you miss her most at bedtime?" she asked softly. Emma nodded without looking away. "Because bedtime was when Mommy always kissed our foreheads." Isabella reached for her sister's hand, her eyes filling with quiet sadness. Amara knelt beside the bed instead of trying to replace a memory that could never belong to her. "No one can take your mother's place," she said gently. And no one should try. But love does not disappear when someone leaves this world. Sometimes it continues through the kindness we share with each other. Emma looked up thoughtfully. Is that why Daddy smiles a little more now? The innocent question caught Amara by surprise. She glanced toward the partially open doorway, unaware that Lorenzo had paused there once again after hearing his daughter's voices. I think, she answered carefully, your father has always loved you with his whole heart. Sometimes grown-ups simply forget that their hearts also need a little help healing. Lorenzo remained perfectly still outside the room, his eyes lowering as those words quietly settled inside him. For months he had devoted every ounce of strength to protecting his daughters from sorrow, never realizing they had been trying just as hard to protect him from his own. And standing in the warm glow of the hallway, he understood that the greatest gift Amara had brought into the mansion was not peaceful sleep. It was permission for an entire family to begin healing together. Autumn slowly settled over the DeLuca estate, dressing the towering maple trees in shades of crimson and gold, while cool afternoon breezes carried fallen leaves across the winding stone paths. The mansion no longer felt frozen in time. Fresh flowers appeared on the dining table each morning because Emma insisted every room deserved something beautiful. Isabella began leaving tiny handwritten notes beside the kitchen coffee maker that simply read, "Have a happy day." Even the staff noticed themselves smiling more often without realizing why. Kindness, it seemed, had a quiet way of becoming contagious. One Saturday afternoon, laughter drifted across the back gardens as Amara helped the twins build a small bird feeder from leftover cedar wood in the maintenance workshop. The project was simple. A few carefully measured boards, safe rounded edges, and bright ribbons chosen by the girls. Emma proudly announced that every bird deserved a place where it felt welcome. Isabella nodded seriously and added that lonely birds probably needed friends too. Watching from the library balcony, Lorenzo found himself smiling before he even realized it. Weeks earlier, he would have considered such an ordinary afternoon insignificant. Now it felt priceless. Later that evening, after dinner had ended and the twins hurried upstairs to choose their bedtime stories, Lorenzo remained alone in the quiet dining room. His eyes wandered toward the empty chair where his wife had always sat, and for the first time the memory brought warmth instead of unbearable pain. He understood that forgetting was never the goal. Living again was. As he stepped into the hallway, he noticed Amara carefully straightening a framed family photograph that had shifted slightly on the console table. She handled it with the same respect she gave everything inside the house, never treating treasured memories as decorations. Lorenzo stopped beside her. You always make sure that picture is perfectly straight, he observed. Amara looked at the smiling faces inside the frame before answering. Because someone loved this family enough to capture this moment forever. I think memories deserve the same care that people do. Lorenzo remained silent, studying the photograph through entirely different eyes. For months he had avoided looking at those pictures because they reminded him of everything he believed he had lost. Amara somehow looked at them and saw everything that still remained. Upstairs, Emma called excitedly from the landing. Daddy, come see what we made. Lorenzo climbed the staircase to find both girls standing proudly beside the bedroom window. Outside, perched on the newly built bird feeder, sat two small bluebirds pecking happily at the scattered seeds. Isabella clapped softly so they would not fly away. They found their new home already, she whispered with amazement. Lorenzo wrapped an arm around each daughter as they watched the birds together. Neither child looked afraid of bedtime anymore. Neither searched the hallway with anxious eyes. When Amara quietly entered carrying the evening storybook, Emma reached for her hand, while Isabella rested comfortably against her father's shoulder. It was such a simple picture that no expensive painting could ever match its beauty. Lorenzo realized then that this mansion had not been restored by wealth, careful planning, or perfect solutions. It had been restored one patient evening at a time by someone who understood that healing begins long before anyone notices the results. As the first stars appeared beyond the bedroom windows, the house itself seemed to breathe differently, no longer echoing with grief, but gently filled with the peaceful sounds of a family learning that love can grow again without replacing the love that came before. Several months later, winter arrived quietly, covering the DeLuca estate with a blanket of fresh snow that sparkled beneath the early morning sun. Inside the mansion, Warmth had returned in ways no fireplace alone could ever provide. Emma and Isabella no longer feared bedtime. Instead, they competed over who could choose the evening story, carefully placing their favorite books beside the rocking chair before dinner even ended. Their laughter echoed through hallways that had once carried only silence, and every member of the household noticed the remarkable difference. The mansion no longer felt like a place where people simply worked. It had become a home again. One peaceful evening, after the twins had fallen asleep with contented smiles on their faces, Lorenzo remained standing outside their bedroom door for a long moment. He listened carefully, not because he expected crying anymore, but because he had grown grateful for the quiet breathing that now filled the room each night. Slowly, he closed the door and walked downstairs, finding Amara in the library carefully returning the last storybook to its shelf. She turned respectfully when she heard his footsteps. "Good evening, sir." Lorenzo looked around the room that had witnessed so much grief and, more recently, so much healing. Then he reached into his jacket pocket and removed a small polished brass key attached to a simple leather tag. Without ceremony, he placed it gently into Amara's hand. She looked down with quiet confusion. "Sir." Lorenzo smiled, a genuine smile that reached his eyes for the first time in longer than anyone inside the mansion could remember. "That is the master key to this house." Amara looked up immediately. "I cannot accept something so important." Lorenzo gently shook his head. "You already accepted something far more important the night you chose to climb those stairs. You accepted responsibility for two frightened little girls when everyone else believed nothing could help them anymore." Amara held the key carefully, but still hesitated. "I only stayed because they needed someone beside them." Lorenzo nodded slowly. "Exactly. You stayed. Not because anyone asked you to. Not because anyone promised you anything in return. You stayed because compassion was more important to you than comfort." His voice softened as he glanced toward the staircase leading to the children's rooms. "I spent months believing I could protect my daughters by surrounding them with every resource money could provide. You quietly reminded me that what they needed most could never be purchased." At that moment, light footsteps crossed the hallway. Emma and Isabella appeared at the top of the staircase wearing matching pajamas, each holding a small handmade paper ornament decorated with crayons and glitter. They hurried down together and placed the ornaments into Amara's hands. Across the front, written in uneven childhood handwriting, were 4 simple words. "Our home feels happy." Tears gathered in Amara's eyes as she looked at the girls, who wrapped their small arms around her without hesitation. Lorenzo watched the embrace in respectful silence, understanding that the greatest changes in life rarely arrive through grand speeches or dramatic moments. They arrive through ordinary acts of kindness repeated with extraordinary consistency. Outside, snow continued falling softly across the quiet grounds, but inside the DeLuca mansion every room seemed brighter than before. Grief had not disappeared. Love had simply learned to grow beside it. And on that peaceful winter evening, everyone under that roof remembered a truth that no amount of power could ever replace. The strongest foundation any family can build is not wealth, influence, or status. It is the quiet courage to stay when someone else needs hope the most. And that day, the world remembered what dignity looks like.